Hello, everyone. Welcome to Libraries in Response, session 116, which is amazing to us that uh, that we have been doing this for now 5 years. Not quite 5 years. It'll be 5 years in March since the pandemic was declared, and we started this off in response to the global crisis that still very much reverberates. I think, we wanted to get back to normal quickly. Of course, we weren't able to quickly or even ever. It seems like there are many changes that were made that have not changed back. There's still so many people, working from home and the whole transformation of commercial real estate. I mean, all these things, and psychologically, it's been really fascinating and frightening to some extent. Excuse me, it's session 117. Let me correct the record there. Human Infrastructure Broadband project that we will hear about from the Benton Institute, looking back, looking around, and looking ahead. So we are the Gigabit Libraries Network. My name's Don Means. I'm the director here of this open consortium of libraries doing interesting, innovative things with technology. And Libraries in Response is our principal webcast and main activity these days. We're hosted and recorded by IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, based in The Hague, and at the helm is Stephen Weiber, the head of public policy for IFLA. This is the organization that all the national libraries and national library associations belong to. So it's a great global network to reach libraries everywhere, especially an interest for us are the 400,000 public libraries around the world. Our series sponsor has been the Institute for Library Services, to the extent that it still exists, which should, and IMLS. And we want to welcome our new sponsors, the New Jersey State Library and the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. Both have come in to help support the series this year, and we very much appreciate that. Our speakers are Adrian Furness, the Executive Director of the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society, and Revati Prasad, the VP of Programs, Benton Institute. So we'll hear from them just in a moment. This is our kind of our mission image, I guess, mission statement in graphic form. This is an illustration by the economist, political cartoonist, Cal. And this just encapsulates us, the situation of libraries in response. Imagine that world is the world of libraries. And these are the kind of the new four horsemen of the apocalypse. And they're all pressing. They're each pressing and they're all pressing. There's a whole realm of discussion around how crises reinforce each other and kind of compound the impact. The latest one being AI, of course, but ever present, the pandemic comes and new ones are on the horizon. And of course, the climate is, we've talked about it a lot. War is a stand-in for politics, which is also on the rise everywhere. So much to do for the poor old world, and it needs the support of libraries, principally, in our view. As to broadband, this is our kind of summary of the main barriers to adoption. Availability, if it's not available, it really doesn't matter if you know how to use it or what it costs or any of that. Availability and affordability, of course. If it is available, you have to be able to afford it, or it's also not very helpful. And this is the point that the libraries can respond to that. Libraries have been built on the idea that communities can pool resources that may, for certain things that may be too expensive for each member of the community to afford, pool those, and then share them, albeit on a limited basis, not unlimited. Makes sense, but it's a brilliant economic concept, really. And affordability with broadband is another way to do that. Many people, the library is the only source of internet they have, and others more than that number actually access the internet at a library, but for different reasons. You know, it's convenient, it's faster, it's safe, it's quiet, all those kinds of reasons. They're all valid, of course. And then we get to usability, which is kind of our catch-all for a lot of things, and it's really too glib to really be meaningful because there are so many aspects of that. And that is basically what we're going to talk about and hear about today is the intention of the Digital Equity Act. Is a very significant program that was passed recently as a kind of a companion to the BEAD Act, which is dealing with the connectivity part. But again, without the ability to really use these resources, they're just not useful. And it's not just the ability; it's also an understanding of what it's good for. If you don't really have a sense of that, then you're not going to be motivated enough to learn how to use it. So that's our case for that. So here we go with Adrian and Revity, and I will stop this screen share and welcome Adrian, who I've known a long time. We've been working on broadband policy for years, and we're also kind of early Shelby people. And the Benton Institute, named for Charles Benton, the late, great Charles Benton, who was a mentor of mine and extremely helpful as we navigated some of these early opportunities and challenges from the beginning of the Obama administration when we got serious about broadband for the first time. So here she is, Adrian. Welcome to Libraries in Response. We're so happy to have you and hear what the report is all about and how you actually are going to do that. I mean, there's a human infrastructure of broadband within our existing infrastructure of institutions and processes. And so how's that all going to work? We're happy to hear everything from you. Go ahead, please.
Well, that's great. And I thank you, Don, so much for inviting Revity and me to be here today. And I just want to give a little bit of background about the Benton Institute and point out that my colleague, Kevin Taglang, has put into the chat a link to the first publication, and Revity will spend a lot of time talking about the project, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the Benton Institute. I am the executive director, as Don said. This is a 44-year-old nonprofit working to make sure everyone in the United States can use and benefit from high-quality, affordable broadband. And we do that by strengthening local, state, and national leadership, by providing timely information and analysis, practical guidance, and the advocacy needed to articulate and implement a broadband for all agenda. So obviously, 44 years, we haven't always focused on broadband, but our DNA has always been about accessible, equitable, and diverse media and telecommunications, which we think can advance people's lives and ensure a thriving democracy. I always like to say that communications policy is complicated, and we look at part of our job as trying to humanize what can seem mysterious, loaded with acronyms, and it really is for the purpose to make sure that people understand how policy can impact their everyday lives and how they can play a role in advocating for themselves and their communities. So Revity has put this first slide up to highlight some of the publications we've done. even going back, I might add, to the one on the lower left of your screen, which was a 2013 publication when I first started this job. We narrowed the focus specifically to be about broadband in 2019, but the values underlying our work have not changed. And so in addition to access, diversity, and equity, we believe in ubiquity, openness, competition, trust, sustainability, and resilience, a lot of the words you see on that 2013 cover. So for 30 years, we have issued a daily newsletter. I actually see some people who are subscribers on this call to headlines. And this, of course, is where you can keep up with everything that is related to broadband at the federal, state, and local levels. We have also worked in 6 states to engage communities in planning deployment of broadband infrastructure and finding the right internet service provider partners. And we advocate, we have coalitions that do advocacy in 4 states. And finally, we're running a group for state legislators and their staff. Because part of what we're doing here is just educating people. You all know this more than anybody. Librarians play such a critical role, and I always like to say are the original digital navigators before that term came up. What I want to talk about now as an introduction to Ravity is that just to put a little bit of shine on ourselves, I do like to say what is unique about us, maybe in the field of public interest organizations, is that we really like to think big picture and long horizon. There's this publication called Broadband for America Now that we did in 2020 and really laid the groundwork for policy that was picked up in great part by the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, including the need for higher speeds, which we all know from the pandemic turned out to be incredibly important for everybody to be able to do things from home. We try to anticipate the challenges and opportunities ahead so we can keep the public in public policy. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague Revati. She's Dr. Revati Prasad. She's a PhD, joined us about 3 years ago. She runs all of our research and programming efforts, and she's going to talk specifically about a new project which we are in the process of launching and talk to you about the 3 phases, what we've done so far, what we're going to do next month, which is just a couple of days away. And so, Revati, let me turn it over to you now to talk about the human infrastructure of broadband. And again, thanks everybody for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Adrienne. And thank you, Dawn, for having us here today. I am going to be talking for a while. So somebody please wave your arms wildly at me if I am going on for too long at some point. Thank you for that introduction, Adrienne, and also Dawn for sort of setting up how Libraries in Response comes sort of coalesced in order to meet the moment of crisis. I don't need to tell this crowd about sort of the spark of COVID, how it upended daily life. And at the time that people needed broadband the most, many families and individuals found themselves unable to access that. So we remember the people in the parking lots, kids doing homeworks. We know that in addition to a Wi-Fi signal, people needed working devices that they may not always have had. They needed to learn how to Zoom, which seems second nature at this point, although I'm sure at some point I will forget to unmute myself. So we were looking at all of the institutions and programs and people that came to help in that moment of crisis. What we're calling the human infrastructure of broadband, which I'll get to in a little bit. And the crisis of the pandemic, of course, prompted a very significant investment in helping get people online. We had the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which includes both the BEAD deployment program, but also the Digital Equity Act programs. But although we've celebrated this moment of taking this need seriously and putting real federal resources to solving these issues, I think we all recognize that the need isn't going to go away. The digital divide remains a chronic issue, and it will remain, as Dawn mentioned, the skills that you need will adapt. The devices you want and need to be a part of the digital society are going to become obsolete. And we're going to have to ensure that people can continue to afford to stay connected to their broadband service, very much in line with what Dawn pointed out as the affordability issue. So we were looking at all of these interesting and really innovative programs, but we wanted to understand how we, and here we mean the collective field, we can support and sustain this human infrastructure of broadband even after the current federal investments have ended. So we know that we have potentially a runway of 4 or 5 years. How will we keep this work going beyond that? What can we do now in order to best place us and position us for the future? So, like I said, I'm using the collective noun. We wanted to focus on something sectoral. We recognize that if we're going to be successful at thinking big picture and long term, as Adrian just said, we're not going to be able to do it by ourselves. And so we worked with the NDIA, the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. We work with the American Library Association, as well as the Digital Equity Research Center, which was housed at the Metropolitan New York Library Council at the time. And we did this collaborative research project where folks from those organizations were part of a research advisory committee that helped us design surveys, look at the findings, lead expert working groups, and were really crucial partners in doing this research. We did 3 phases of research. The first was a landscape assessment, just sort of looking around and trying to get a sense of what is happening now and where does this work come from. So some looking back, looking around, and then looking forward, which is the title of our first report. We've done about a dozen case studies. I think I'll ask Kevin to drop the link in the chat, but we have released 7 or 8 of them so far, and we'll be releasing the remainder over the course of the next few days. And lastly, we did expert working groups and policy consultations that were focused on developing a framework or an approach to how we can continue to support this work going forward. Sorry, I have 2 screens, and sometimes it takes me a second to switch back and forth. Okay, so I think the first thing that I want to convince you of, the one thing I want you to take away from this conversation, is why human infrastructure, right? So what do we mean by infrastructure? The definition that has always most strongly resonated with me is by the scholar Brian Larkin, who defined it as objects that create the grounds on which other objects operate, and when they do so, they operate as systems. So they create the ground for other objects to work, and they work as a system. So your classic example is roads. They allow for movements of goods and they interconnect, so they operate in a network. We're arguing here that the work of connecting people to devices, to broadband service, or to skills is the underpinning that will allow a digital society and economy to flourish and benefit us all, right? So here, when we say human infrastructure broadband, we're talking about direct digital support. And like roads or other infrastructure, the work of the human infrastructure broadband does not occur in isolation. This is part, like Dawn was saying, as part of a larger digital inclusion ecosystem. And the ecosystem, as our collaborator, Dr. Colin Reinsmith, has defined it, is a combination of programs and policies that meet a geographic community's unique and diverse connectivity needs. So part of calling this work infrastructure is branding. Other scholars have proposed the idea of community infrastructure and social infrastructure, where they're showing us the importance of networks of places and people. We're taking a page out of their book to underscore the critical importance of this work. So this is essential. This is infrastructure that a bunch of other stuff relies on. And human, because this work is profoundly social and relational. It requires patience to explain. and sometimes explain again, how to do something that may have become second nature to many of us. And the humility to know that evolving technologies will leave us behind too. It's complex work, not just because demonstrating someone's eligibility for subsidized broadband, hello ACP, can be a Byzantine process. But it also brings with it a deeply affective component, right? People feel shame, fear, anxiety, but also excitement and pride. It's all part of this work. Any digital navigator will tell you the importance of empathy, patience, cross-cultural sensitivity, not to mention trust. So the large majority of the immense IIJA investment is focused on building networks where people are or underconnected, but we want to underscore that fiber optic cables may just be glass in the ground if we cannot help people connect to and use that high-speed broadband. Okay, so what is our first report? We launched this a couple of weeks ago. The first report sort of sets up why the human infrastructure of broadband is a necessary social and relational complement to the work of building physical infrastructure. We do a historical overview of how the concepts of universal access and digital divide have evolved with technological progress. And so it's a literature review because we are also a bunch of academics. We also conduct a landscape assessment of the ongoing work. So we did surveys. We worked with NDIA that had an inventory of digital navigator programs that they knew about. And we built this database about 250 very diverse programs that also had a fair amount of geographic diversity. And sort of the first thing that we did based on that data we collected was we developed a taxonomy of the human infrastructure of broadband. Basically, we are defining organizations and programs in 3 buckets: core, complementary, and coalition. So that's the second takeaway I would like you to go home with today, or continue to stay home with today. So the taxonomy hinges on how the direct digital support fits into an organization's larger mission. So when we say core, we mean organizations for whom digital equity is the center of their work. And here we're thinking about nonprofits that focus first and foremost on digital equity. So think about organizations that provide devices primarily or provide digital skills training. And we include libraries because, as Dawn just explained, and Adrian just also reiterated, libraries are the original digital navigators. Their core mission is information services. I mean, public libraries have played a vital role in providing access to internet devices and digital content since the beginning of the internet, particularly for people of color and youth and low-income households, right? In 2019, I think we had 54 million Americans access the internet in public libraries, and 95% of public libraries offer some sort of formal or informal digital literacy training. 1 in 5 of libraries are involved in some sort of digital equity coalition, and almost half the libraries are offering internet hotspots out for checkout, et cetera. So we put libraries in the core bucket. In complementary, we think about organizations that have a wider mission, but have added digital equity work because it is so core to helping, it is so essential to helping them serve their mission, right? So we're thinking about health, housing, education agencies. So a housing agency may recognize that providing broadband to their residents is just as essential as helping them find heat or water, and it is important for them to be able to apply for jobs and then be able to potentially move out of affordable housing units. We looked at nonprofits with broader mission that have added on digital equity work. We consider tribal entities that are, and here we're thinking about tribally owned internet service providers, tribal governments, because they're more broadly interested in the overall thriving of Native populations. And they tend to typically approach digital equity work a little bit different than US government agencies, like cities, counties, et cetera. And then lastly, we talk about coalitions. We found it really important to recognize coalitions separately, even if their work was coordinating and not delivering direct services, because coalitions bring the core and the complementary together. The organizations within a coalition could be core, they could be complementary, they could, but they are working together with a focus on digital equity. Here we're thinking of city governments like Seattle. We're thinking about sort of nonprofit coalitions like the Black Churches for Digital Equity. And we're thinking about organizations like the Kupuna Collective in Hawaii, which is a health-focused digital equity coalition. I've started to already talk a little bit about what we are learning from the case studies, from the taxonomy. But what we did after we understood these three buckets was we conducted 12 case studies for each of the three program models. So under core, we did the Denver Library and the Mercedes, Texas Library. It's called the Dr. Hector P. Garcia Memorial Library. And Free Geek, which is a device-focused nonprofit, and Everyone On, which is a skills-focused nonprofit. In complementary, we did case studies of North Carolina Community College, Mass General Digital Access Coordinator Program. This is a healthcare setting. Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority, the Northwest Center, which is just a community-based organization that added on digital equity work, and the Gila River Digital Connect Initiative, which is a tribal entity that has been serving its residents in Arizona. And for coalitions, we looked, as I mentioned, City of Seattle, Black Churches for Digital Equity, and the Kupuna Collective, which is a statewide collective. So for our case studies, both the Denver and the Mercedes case studies are available now on our website. We've released them as both individual stories, and they are collected on our Human Infrastructure Broadband page. But I want to pull out a couple of things that we learned from each of those very different settings, right? So we have Denver. We are talking about 27 locations. It's a really innovative hub for digital equity throughout the city. It's been really at the forefront, right? And then the Mercedes, Texas Library is a very small rural library, but it's still doing a lot of programming in Spanish. They have sought new funding to be able to do digital navigation services. The thing that we learned across both of the library case studies and additional core case studies is there is a dynamic that core organizations have to navigate between being a destination, being a place where other people know to go, versus being in community and doing outreach. And that is going to depend a lot on sort of the overall capacity, staff capacity, resources available to that library. The City of Mercedes Library is able to do that because they sought specific funding and they formed partnerships. Partnerships are going to be crucial to getting the word out there for libraries. And then from the Denver Public Library, the one thing that I really want to stress is the digital navigator team needs to be prepared to experience sort of the emotional challenges of work. When it is helpful to think of digital navigation as, or the direct digital support as much social work as anything else. And what starts with, I need to reset my password, can evolve into a much more complex and personal challenge that digital navigators will find themselves dealing with on a pretty regular basis. And that can, the folks at Denver Public Library learned, it can have like an emotional impact on them as well. So this was sort of an understanding. The first two pieces of the research project were focused on understanding what is going on, so the landscape assessment and where it came from, and then the case studies were about delving deep into how the dynamics of different program models are functioning, what kinds of populations they might be best positioned to serve, et cetera. Then we wanted to look a little bit forward. So we conducted 3 expert working groups based on the 3 legs of the stool: the device access and maintenance, free and affordable service, and digital skills. And the idea was to assemble 10 to 15 people who are leading experts in the field who've done this for a long time, and identify what are the most promising best practices, so what's working, and then what else do they need, or sometimes not even else, just what do they need to continue this work going forward. And obviously library expertise was central to this. So Lara Clark from the American Library Association, who is a member of our research advisory committee, Brooklyn Public Library, Cuyahoga Public Library, Mercedes, Denver, New York Public Library. These were all some of the folks that were part of our expert working groups. And we divided this up for the three legs of the stool, and I'm going to start with devices. How am I on time, by the way?
You're doing great.
Okay, great. Right, so this is probably widely known in this room, but most efforts to get people free or affordable devices rely on refurbishing and reusing. So the focus for refurbishers tends to be on establishing an efficient model, making sure that they're getting enough devices in and then getting them back out to the people who need them and doing so quickly. They're not fine wine. Devices aren't going to get better over time. You don't want to hand people vinegar, as one of our experts put it. A lot of the most active refurbishers are trying to kill two birds with one stone by using refurbishing also as a teaching experience. So Camden in North Carolina uses it as a chance for high schoolers to learn technical skills. The hands-on experience, people who work on networks or devices will tell you how important that is to sort of demystify technology, that it isn't magic, but it's bits and bobs that you can learn about. Especially when, at a moment when sort of technology aims to be seamless and invisible, cracking open the hood can be incredibly empowering. There are some folks who are working on getting people new devices, and they underscore the value of that unboxing and the excitement to learn and use that comes with something new. Their distribution models often rely on learn-to-earn programs. So you take a 3 weeks course and you get an appropriate device at the end of it. But what was really important to stress was both models said you have to have tech support built in, because as the quote on the right says, you can't just put a laptop in a box and send it over and that's that. You have to make sure that people are able to use the device and able to continue using the device, that you can keep it in working order. So they have to run in call centers. They need to have some place where people can go when they have problems. And the most effective way that many of our experts found was to partner with community-based organizations, so to go where people are. And the last thing I want to say about devices is the quote on the bottom right, that oftentimes people are not seeing devices as a specific funding needs, right? Even if you're able to convince them about the importance of digital equity, someone described it as the redheaded stepchild of the digital equity world, right? And as the quote shows, before he was working on the field himself, if you had told him 1 in 5 people don't have a computer at home, he would not have believed you. So then the recognition of the need specifically for devices appears to be pretty extensive. In terms of service, right, and talk about free and affordable service, you probably all know this from your own experience, but we are all sort of living in the post-ACP world and still grappling with what that loss means. So for those who may not know, the Affordable Connectivity Program, which evolved from the emergency broadband benefit during the pandemic, provided a consumer subsidy of $30 to low-income households, $75 to tribal households, to defray the cost of your broadband bill. It had 23 million households receiving the benefit when it ended in May, June 2024. And the program, despite being very successful, despite being lauded by the field, was not refunded by Congress. There are many hopes and bills about refunding ACP, but nothing has really come to fruition, which has been a challenge for people in the field, because they put their own credibility at stake in trying to get folks enrolled, get the word out about ACP, and they feel the loss, not just for the people who are less able to afford their broadband bill, but also because there was a sense of security. There was a recognition that came with the ACP that, right, this is important and it is a need that does need to be addressed. So when we talk about what digital equity practitioners can do now, we're often left with really some band-aids, right? People are trying to come up with strategies to increase household income or reduce other expenses. Some are working on convincing ISPs to either donate bandwidth, called digital philanthropy, or ensure that ISPs offer low-cost plans. There are some alternatives in terms of finding funding. One would be using federal housing subsidies, work with local governments to build networks, although some states do not allow municipal networks, incentivize anchor institutions to provide Wi-Fi. One of the clearest findings of our expert working groups was how many public libraries did not, like one of the first things they did when COVID hit was basically expand their Wi-Fi footprint so that more people in the neighborhood could access their hotspots. And then other forms of alternative networks like hotspots or mesh networks. We've also seen states start to take more of an active role. New York has the Affordable Broadband Act that establishes the requirement for a low-income plan. And it remains to be seen what how BEAD's low-income, BEAD being the deployment program under IIJA, how BEAD addresses low-income options for broadband service for government-supported networks. So when we talk about digital skills, this was potentially my favorite of the expert groups because it got very detailed. When we talk about digital skills, one of the first things that comes up is what skills are we even talking about? And then obviously, what's the best way to teach them? So as the quote on the top right talks about who's deciding what skills are important to learn. And what emerged in our focus groups, in our working groups, was this understanding that when a learner is walking in the door and they have a functional thing they want to do and they want to learn, the skill is the way that the skill they need is best delivered in sort of an on-demand way, right? The on-demand support fulfills emergent needs that it is not really possible to set up a syllabus for. You have to be able to respond to a learner's lived experience, meet them where they are. It's about being able to talk to your kid's teacher and then tailor instruction to their pace and context, right? Classroom settings, on the other hand, are appropriate for more advanced skills. Excel 101. People who have some idea of what they want to learn so they can sign up for the course that is appropriate for them. And they are motivated enough to make a commitment over time. Yes, I will show up for the next week for this class. I can make that time for myself. And because a structured curriculum is effective for that type of learning, it makes sense to learn about columns and rows in Excel and eventually get to pivot tables, which I still have to learn. Because partly a curriculum is also helpful because you want to be able to demonstrate to someone else that you have acquired this established set of skills. You don't need to prove to anyone that you know how to do Zoom with your kid's teacher, but if you're going to say, I'm certified to be able to do some basic web design, then being able to show I finished this curriculum is going to be valuable, especially to an employer, right? The conversation about skills also really opened up a very interesting and critical conversation about safety and privacy. That ensuring that when you bring more people onto the internet or increase their access, you are not exposing them to greater harms, scams, surveillance, misinformation. I mean, who in this room does not find the idea of online safety completely overwhelming? So our experts pointed out some best practices about teaching skills. One of them was you have to sort of integrate it in all touch points. You have setting up an email address, you need to also talk about two-factor authentication. You should use storytelling and humor to make it fun, especially because ideas around safety and privacy can be so emotionally weighty, and they can bring with them shame and fear about having been scammed before, potentially, or knowing someone who was scammed before. And they also want to, at the same time, talk about safety as a practice. It's not like you're going to download one thing and bam, you're done, but it's going to be an ongoing practice. And the way to address, to best address safety and privacy skills is to help people think of it as a continuum. So at the end of this day, are you a little bit more in control than you were before? Do you have a little more understanding? So to make it a thing that you do on a continuous basis and start to get a little bit better. And then lastly, what was very strong in the arguments that came across in our expert working group was you also need to be able to trust people. So both from our library group and from our tribal case study specifically, trust was really stressed for marginalized populations, and it takes time to build that trust. So you have to think about the long horizon of that. All right. So this is the part that we are currently working on now, which is the final report and how we're going to be taking these previous components and try to put them in some sort of coherent framework for what we as a field can do going forward. We're calling it From the Ground Up, Investing in the Human Infrastructure of Broadband. This is broadly our approach. We're thinking about, and we came to this because we did a policy consultation in October. We invited digital equity experts, community financing experts, and policy entrepreneurs, all sorts of people that would be able to help us think through, this is what we've learned from the field. This is what the field is saying is working and what the field is saying is needed collectively. So now how do we make this happen? What kinds of policy infrastructure, what kind of funding infrastructure, what kind of capacity is needed? So our recommendation framework is both systems focused and fields focused. By systems focused, we're talking about policy and funding. And I guess funding is policy, obviously. And then we're talking about building a constituency in terms of the field and building capacity in the field. Before I go any further about what I mean by these things, I'm going to say we have two sort of overarching pieces, sort of principles that we are incorporating. First being there is a need to balance digital equity support and work between core and complementary organizations. Complementary organizations are incredibly valuable in being able to layer on digital equity support. Sometimes people are already there. So in a healthcare setting, you're already going to see folks that are potentially on Medicaid and are having troubles logging onto the patient portal, for instance. And that is critical support, and that should be integrated both programmatically and in terms of funding. But that is not going to get to all of their digital equity needs. You still need to be able to have a place where they can go to get devices and troubleshoot devices, et cetera. So we need a balance overall between core and complementary. And then our next overarching principle is that coalitions are going to be key to that. That coalitions are going to be key to bringing people together, disseminating learning, and also pushing an advocacy agenda forward and sort of setting the agenda and ensuring that people are aware of the human infrastructure of broadband and understand the need to continue to support it. Sorry, I'm just checking to see if I missed something in the chat. Okay. So our systems-focused recommendations are focused on a policy environment, and I will start by saying this is a non-exhaustive list. There will be other policy interventions and other ways of approaching financing that are going to be important for this work going forward. This is sort of the beginning and a way for us to toss out what feels like low-hanging fruit and urgent steps that can be taken. So the first things first is we want to make sure that we're not going backwards. We learned a bunch of lessons through the pandemic. We got some federal attention. We can't lose the momentum. We have to actually build on our wins. So that means we think there should be a permanent affordable broadband benefit available to people. Maybe that's at a national level, maybe that it's more states adopting something like the New York law, but it needs to be that it can be emailed to everybody. It needs to be that we are building further in terms of affordability. And then secondly, what came up a lot in our research was that there tends to be a little bit of institutional amnesia, like we build up with one major program and then we allow that work to dissipate and we lose the knowledge and expertise that is built up. So the tactic that we think to address that kind of loss of knowledge and learning is we have to both institutionalize state offices, they have to stick around in terms of broadband and digital equity, and they have to be empowered to conduct ongoing oversight. They have to make sure that the ISPs that promise to build networks are actually doing that. They have to make sure that there are actually affordable service options available to people. Somebody needs to look out for all of the promises that are being made in this moment are actually being fulfilled. And then the funding question is about being innovative and open in trying to find the funding to do this work. So firstly, we are making the low-hanging fruit is that you can integrate direct digital support into already existing programs, things like housing programs. HUD has shown itself somewhat flexible in how they are allowing broadband to be covered. Telehealth, workforce development legislation, basically as you're thinking about other support services to layer in direct digital support on top of that. And then speaking of that balance again, we have to create mechanisms within state budgets that provide funding for digital inclusion funds. Some states have already done this. Washington has, for instance, and the city of Seattle uses a technology matching fund that is funded by cable franchise fees to fund digital inclusion work. We're also calling on place-based philanthropy to prioritize digital equity. Specifically, we want them, there is a tendency to think about, oh, there's all of this money coming in, so this problem is solved, right? It's not. And we think the philanthropy, especially place-based philanthropy, is really well positioned to anchor digital equity work. And then some of the more financially minded community financing people in our policy consultation pointed out to market-based mechanisms like e-commerce revenue, CFDIs. There's a potential idea out there about taxing online gambling to pay for an affordability benefit. Think big, think creatively, think of the possibilities to find funding for this is, I think, the takeaway there. And then lastly, around funding, we want to make sure that we can ease the administrative burdens on small organizations to pursue funding. When we were putting our work in this, people were applying for the competitive award under the Digital Equity Act, and small organizations were essentially shut out. But the small organizations we have found are the ones that are able to build trust in communities over time. So we want to make sure that small organizations that may not be able to bear the administrative burden of applying for or maintaining the reporting requirements of large grants are still able to pursue funding in this work, in this field. Oh, this is a cutoff. Okay. In terms of field focused, we put it in two buckets. One is build a constituency. I'm putting it in terms of we need to build a bigger table and we need to invite a bunch of folks to it. Because digital equity is so essential to the work of so many other sectors, we have to be able to integrate it and make them, we need more skin in the game. We need folks to be invested in healthcare. We need folks in workforce to be invested, and growing that constituency will help ensure that we are able to do the policy and funding environment that is most beneficial to our work. And then we simultaneously, as I said, build a bigger table. We also need to anchor the growing constituency. We need to put it in terms of a national foundation or a local level. You need, like, coalitions and coordinations and building a constituency, it won't just happen. Someone needs to take the lead. There needs to be direction and resources. And so we think having anchors for that is really crucial. Maybe that's the library in a community. And lastly, I'm going to talk about building capacity, which is making sure there's a people pipeline, so workforce development for the folks that are doing this work. We want to develop and disseminate and institutionalize best practices. So one of the things I was doing right before this is talking to one of our research fellows about how a health equity system can incorporate digital navigation. So what does the intersection of digital health and digital navigation digital health equity and digital equity look like? And then lastly, we want to support research that identifies needs, identifies promising approaches, and then demonstrates the impact of digital support and the cost of digital exclusion. I think we so focus on saying, oh, look, the education test results are higher potentially. But we can also talk about how individual digital exclusion has societal costs. And we need to bring that forward about what happens when you set up an app around travel, but for like transit benefits. But the people that you need to get it to are the ones that aren't actually able to use it. So you have spent all this money on a program that isn't actually doing the thing you want to do. Okay. And the last thing I will say, I know that Don told me to wind up, is that we are putting on call to action that the moment to engage is now. If competitive awards and capacity awards are going out under Digital Equity Act, we have a little bit of a runway, and we think advocacy and engagement around this work now can help set us up for the future, because as I started, I'm going to end with this work will be necessary for the foreseeable future, right? The cost of broadband will remain a primary obstacle for adoption. Skills are outpaced by evolving technologies or emerging threats. So apparently we're all supposed to be using encrypted texting platforms now. And then obviously devices we know are designed to either be disposable or become obsolete. So these challenges are also not limited to the so-called covered populations. They impact us all. And the human infrastructure broadband is necessary for all of us to be able to enjoy a digital society and digital economy. And before I close, our project was supported by the Pew Charitable Trusts, who have also been very active and engaged and supportive partners in the work as well. I'm going to stop talking.
Wow. That's so impressive, Revity. The scope of what you folks are taking on is really vast, and it's impressive, really, and of course it's definitely needed. I did want to welcome Kevin back. Kevin was a presenter several years ago, so this is not the first Benton appearance on Libraries in Response. You touched on, so many things. The one that really struck me, well, there are a bunch of them, but one, you mentioned trust, of course, and it is critical for new users, well, for existing users to trust systems and providers and the rest of it. And that's, of course, the strength of libraries, is they start with a basis of trust. Their communities trust them. As trust declines generally across society and especially across the internet, libraries are rising up as a place to go to ask for help and services. On the devices aspect of it, the slide you had just before skills listed different kinds of elements to that, and one of those is kind of affordability and availability. And so one of the things that libraries have been doing is not only extending wireless capacity out of the building, something we advocated like on day one of the pandemic, with turn the Wi-Fi router to the window at least, and then even further. Of course, we've done projects using various kinds of wireless technology to extend library Wi-Fi deeper into communities. But another strategy related to that is checking out hotspots from libraries. We understand that roughly half of the libraries in the country offer that service. Does that fits into your mixture of devices?
I think in an ideal world, people would be able to own their devices and be able to have continuous access to them. But device maintenance is an ongoing issue. And part of that is also, so a lot of states, when they did their survey, the way they asked that question was like, how long will you be without a device if your main device has an issue? So the ability to be able to check out hotspots or the ability to be able to borrow devices then becomes really critical for keeping that ongoing access, which is, it's not like a one and done kind of thing. It's not like once I hand you a Chromebook, your problems are solved. It's about making sure that people have a continuous access to devices. And the other thing I also wanted to say was, obviously libraries are essential, but there's two things that I would like to, one core thing that I want to mention is that there's also a tendency to sort of put everything on the libraries, and we found when doing our research that libraries are also incredibly overtaxed. We are asking them to take on more and more without doing a commensurate increase in the resources available to them. So I want to underscore both the importance of libraries, but also supporting the libraries to be able to do all of the things that we are asking them to do.
Absolutely. Libraries constitutionally seem enabled to say no, and that can pile up a lot of. We use the Swiss Army knife as our metaphor for libraries, offering more service to more people than any other institution. And that growing list can be daunting without the support, especially as other agencies transfer their support services onto the library. You know, the e-government, can you help us? You know, this and that. So the other thing that you mentioned is really important, I thought, is potential harm. It's changed since we all began this broadband expansion initiative a decade or so ago, and now it's feeling like we're leading lambs to slaughter because the hazardous environment the internet has become. And it was we had Vint Cerf on a couple of weeks ago, and Vint posited that even analogous to giving a teenager an automobile and driving them around the parking lot once and say, "Here, kid, take it out. It's go on your date." It's what it does it justify almost a level of certification the way driving does, because it's really difficult even for experienced users not to succumb to various kinds of scams and phishing schemes. So where do you prioritize that level? Because people are kind of worried in the first place there's going to break something, and then now you tell them there are all these dangers out there. So where do you put that in the mix, and how much of a priority do you give that without making people even more fearful?
I mean, I think this is essential, and this is where our work needs to go, is to ensure that the internet we're welcoming people onto is a place anyone should actually be. And part of the, I think, solution, and I think when Adrienne had her slide up, one of the reports that was up there was building safety and privacy into digital inclusion efforts, which is what work one of our fellows, Greta Byram, did about thinking about how even the current grants shouldn't think about including digital privacy and safety in their work. One of the main arguments that she's making is that we have to understand that this is a societal risk and not just an individual risk. Some people are more at risk than others, but this is something that needs a collective response. It isn't just about having one person having a password manager and then you're fine. It's rather about making sure that the infrastructure, the protocols are already in place, that people know where to go, that there are continuous advisories around potential scams that are currently happening. The FTC does provide some data, but states don't. Not all states do. And so to make it so that it is a social issue that we are all paying attention to, and it's not just a matter of individual knowledge or individual practices, although those are important pieces of the solution.
Indeed, indeed. Before we ask Adrienne to give us a closing statement, I just wanted to observe that the basis of what you're doing is, based on inclusion, and we in our current environment we have a kind of assault on the entire concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You might call it monoculture, loyalty, and exclusion. It seems to be the price of the day. That's a topic for another session, I think, because it's a really big topic, and of course it's political, but policy is political. So, Adrienne, give us a final closeout of what this is, how this is all meaningful, and what you hope to see.
Well, thanks, Don, very much. Thank you for giving us the opportunity again to talk. This is our first presentation, first of many that we'll be doing about this work. But I do want to reiterate that this was a really collaborative project. You cannot do this without the collaboration of a lot of people, our research advisory team, the people who participated in the working groups, the writers of our case studies, and finally the policy entrepreneurs, this is a Ravity term, which I love, that participated in the final session and really thought long and hard about how we move forward after this federal investment is completed. I noticed that there was one from Illinois, and I love seeing him. I don't see him now, but he was on the call. He was a NTIA state broadband officer. And, I think that it's so important for us as a field to be really supportive of the kind of ongoing advocacy and battles that we're going to have to fight to see these funds dispersed, because what we really point out in our recommendations is that while there's a lot of things we can do on our own, this field really does need to look at ways to fund itself, whether it's through government grants at all levels, whether it's through philanthropy, whether it's through creative financing. And we come up with some interesting ideas there. But I think all of us at this particular point are super nervous about this DEI thing, Don, that you suggested. Is really under fire, and it could, just the word equity, Digital Equity Act, could really put us in danger. So I want everybody to be on their toes and speak to their local representatives and your state representatives and your federal representatives about making sure that they know that this human infrastructure is a necessary complement to the wires in the ground that are going to be laid. As going back to Ravity's very first comment about it's just glass on the ground if we don't have the people who are working with everyone to make sure that they can utilize broadband and live better lives and have better communities. So thanks again, Don, for having us. And if you all want to be in touch to talk about the report further, we welcome anybody's outreach on an individual basis. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Beautifully summarized, Adrienne and Ravity. This has been very enlightening and stimulating and inspiring. So good luck to us all. And we'll close the recording with that.
Thanks, Don.